Hello and welcome to Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks. Our guest on this episode was one of the most respected leaders of the Western world in the latter years of the 20th century, former Canadian Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, a colleague, confidant, and friend to fellow G7 leaders like Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and others, and then a sought-after advisor to CEOs and multinational organizations. Mr. Mulroney and his wife Mila now enjoy semi-retirement in Montreal and Palm Beach, Florida, where we sat down for the following conversation. Prime Minister, thanks so much for agreeing to join us for this interview.
Happy to be with you today.
Well, you know, there's so much that we could discuss about your life and your career, but 30 minutes isn't enough time to get into real detail.
Yeah.
So let me start almost from a 10,000-foot level and 30 years of perspective. You were Prime Minister of Canada from 1984 to 1993. Do you look back on those years generally as a great success, or do you sometimes wish you had some of those years back to do over?
Oh, I think every president or prime minister has regrets and say, gee, if I had that to do over, I'd do it differently. But generally speaking, I'll quote my friend Ronald Reagan, when they asked him how he thought his 8 years had gone. And he said, well, not bad, not bad. And I think I'd say the same thing about our government. We were there 9 years. We did very big and convulsive things, which were very unpopular, very challenged and unpopular at the time, like free trade and NAFTA and tax reform and the GST. But they've all turned out to be durable, and they're still there today. And the reason is that they bring such benefits to Canada. You know, I always said, Jim, that I was going to govern not for easy headlines in 10 days, but for a better Canada in 10 years. And I think, generally speaking, with some errors along the way, obviously, that's what we've done.
Do you think history and historians have served you well?
Well, it's too early, you know. But as Churchill said when asked how history was going to treat him, he said, I think history will treat me very well, because I plan to write it myself. So well, I can't do that, but I got my...
And you have. This book is now 15 years old,
yeah.
But it's a wonderful read, and I commend you on it.
Thank you.
What would you say are some of the highlights of those 9 years that really stick out in your mind?
Yeah. Well, politically, I think the big events, of course, because without the political results, you don't become Prime Minister. So I think the fact that I won the largest victory in the history of Canada, and then I won another major victory 4 years later, I think that thereby becoming the first Conservative Prime Minister to do this in 100 years, that was the political stuff that I thought, you know, will stand up in history. On the substantive matters, I think that our work bringing the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement to Canada that I did with President Reagan, and then I did the NAFTA with President Bush, the Acid Rain Treaty, which cleaned up our environment, our work internationally when we liberated Nelson Mandela and caused, in some considerable measure, the abolition of apartheid in South Africa. I think that those big ticket items like that will stand the test of time. I certainly hope so.
When you were first elected PM in '84, you provided a lot of Canadians with the hope that you would be able to perhaps be a unifying force for some of the dissatisfaction that was happening in Canada, particularly in your home province of Quebec, which had been flirting with the idea of secession for nearly a decade, and also Western Canada, which, and I guess specifically Alberta, which had a festering unhappiness about the way the rest of Canada was succeeding from its oil and gas. By the end of your tenure, not much had really changed. There was still rancor and dissatisfaction. Do you think those two provinces will ever be happy in the Canadian unification?
Well, political happiness, Jim, is relative. You know, the country's doing well by any standard, and Canada's always done well. Where in many ways we're a very blessed and fortunate nation. Sometimes we don't realize how much. We have this great neighbor to the south, with whom we should have excellent relationships. So we've got a lot to be happy about. But you know, regional alienation is a feature of a great nation, the second largest nation in the world after Russia, but with a population that only hits 38 million. So it's spread thinly across 5,000 miles. And that gives rise to the strength in regions, and it dissipates a lot of the strength at the national level. So a prime minister always has to be conscious of that reality. Geography plays a big role in our political life. Margaret Thatcher used to say, you know, within 1 hour, I can be anywhere in the kingdom. And within an hour, Brian can't get to the airport. So it gives you an idea of the dimensions of the challenge given our geography.
Let's move on and talk about some of the world leaders that you worked with and knew well. I think there's no question that one of your strengths as Prime Minister, and a good part of your legacy, was your ability to get on with other world leaders. You had a very pragmatic view of the world order. Without getting too deep into the details of specific geopolitical issues of the day, I want to just throw out some names that we all know and ask about your personal relationship with them and your view of them 30 years later. And let's start, obviously, with your great friend, Ronald Reagan.
Well, President Reagan was a consummate political leader. In an interesting way, I always thought that his greatest quality as a leader was that he was in communion with Americans. And when he sat down as President of the United States, he exemplified the strength and in many ways, the majesty of the office of President. I liked him. We got along very well personally. We were great friends. He was an easy guy to deal with, funny, entertaining, but very firm. He knew what he once told me, he said, you know, Brian, I'm not here to deal with details. I've got my views of the world, free trade, strong America, anti-communist, anti-Soviet, he had 4 or 5 main issues. He said, I deal with those and I let my cabinet ministers and others deal with the details. So he wasn't a detail guy, but I admired him and liked him a lot.
His successor, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah, wonderful guy. George Bush knew more about foreign policy than any group of professors combined from the United States. He was a detailed man. He loved foreign affairs in particular. He knew the cousins of the presidents of this country and that. He knew all the nuances of foreign policy. Most of all, he was America's gentleman in dealing with foreign leaders and foreign countries. He was never a bully. He never threw his weight around. But you always knew that you were dealing with a dignified, highly impressive, brave, and resolute man. I mean, this guy was 19, fighting off the Japanese against Imperial Japan. Very courageous guy. I love Bush.
Talking about resolute, the Iron Lady, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Well, Margaret was we served together a long time. And then after she was overthrown, I was still in office, and so we had her visit us in Harrington Lake, which is the Prime Minister's summer residence. We spent a lot of time together in her retirement. And I loved Margaret. She never changed. She was the best prepared person at any meeting, the most incisive debater I've ever seen, and the most vigorous defender of British interests who ever existed. And she was the epitome of leadership. It was very unfortunate that that in turn, in some regrettable way, led to her overthrow by her own party. Because you remember when she used to say, I'm going to go on and on and on. But you know, this is a democracy. You don't say that or do that. And I think that that led to a brisure between her and her caucus, which resulted in her highly regrettable overthrow as Prime Minister.
Last one. And a man who, for a short time at least, really was the architect of a new world order. I mean, Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah. Well, I met Gorbachev in the Kremlin the day he became leader in March of 1985. And I went back and I said to President Reagan, who was coming to Quebec City a few days later, and he hadn't met him, hadn't seen him. I said, Ron, this is a new game in town. This guy's entirely different. And I think that you will get along, ultimately, are going to get along well with him. He wants to do deals that will advance the social welfare of the Russian people, of the Soviet people. And indeed, that's what he did. Gorbachev is today not the figure that he is going to become in history. He will be, like Mandela, for different reasons, a giant in history, because the dissolution of the Soviet Union was probably the greatest epical event of the 20th century. And it came about without firing a shot. And everybody, including me, gives credit to President Reagan for his leadership in this area, but he couldn't have done it without Gorbachev on the other side. I view him in the same light as I view Nelson Mandela, who was a great leader, a great friend of ours. And Gorbachev and I have remained friendly over all of these years. And we worked together very carefully. No, he's going to be a giant in history.
Let's talk about Canada. Here we are nearly 3 decades after you left office. Let me ask you how you feel about Canada's future ahead today. Do you think that you are as optimistic as you might have been 30 years ago when you left the prime ministership?
I am. Look, every prime minister builds upon the successes of his predecessors. Canada is now 155 years old or thereabouts. Yeah. It's a functioning, prosperous, admired democracy in the world. And so that means success, a long-term success. We've got what we have to do to continue to achieve that. We need a much greater population. I've been advocating for a population increase from our present 38 million to 75 to 100 million people that we've got to do.
We've got the room for it.
We have the room, and we just have to do it. I think that we have to strike down all interprovincial trade barriers that exist in Canada. We have got to energize our people and educate our people in terms of Aboriginal fairness for our First Nations. And we've got to get rid of this scourge of anti-Semitism that's everywhere, including polite old Canada. We've got to get rid of that. And you know, we've got to increase our productivity as a nation. You know, our productivity is lower than that of the state of Mississippi. And that's a tax on the Canadian prosperity. We've got to do better. I think that we should look for the free trade area of the Americas, which would bring in 34 nations with 1 billion people and a GDP of $30 trillion a year. This is where Canada could provide leadership, because we've done it before. And we've got to develop our natural resources, including our oil and gas resources, in harmony with a policy of the environment, favoring the environment. It can be done. People say it can't be done. Of course it can be done. I mean, if you can put a man on the moon, you can do this. And at the moment, we're stalled. Now, the pandemic has been largely responsible for that, but we don't have big ideas anymore. We don't have big ideas. And our country needs the satisfaction and the challenge that comes from meeting big ideas, achieving great things. And, you know, we're, as I say, maybe it's all the pandemic, I'm not sure, but we've got to do better.
You know, we're sitting here on a lovely day in the late winter of 2022, and while things are pretty quiet in Canada, these are very turbulent times in this country. How do you see the short-term future for America? Because there's a lot of unhappiness in this country.
Well, you know, I'm of the school that says that the United States of America is the greatest democratic republic that God ever placed on the face of this earth. And nobody ever made a nickel betting against America. So while there's a lot of nonsense going on at the top, I have great confidence in the American people. You know, to see their way through this and come back big time with a lot of success. But I must admit that the turbulence we're seeing now, political turbulence, the polarization in America, the antipathy that exists between parties and between people is something that we've never seen. I've never seen before anyway. I've known 10 American presidents, and I've worked intimately with 3. And this is something brand new to me. I've never seen it before. I've never seen presidents act like this before or say things like this before. And so it's new to me, but I have great confidence in the institutions of the United States and the people of the United States.
Let me ask you about China. Are we in the Western world justified in thinking, and I quote, be afraid, be very afraid?
The answer to that is yes and no. Yes, China right now is looking for hegemony in all kinds of areas, some of them very worrisome. But so the attitudes can be either we shove them off to the side, not deal with them, or we engage with them, policy of engagement. And we have to do that. Because China is not going anywhere. You've got 1.4 billion people that are only going to grow and stay in size and strength, and we must deal with them. And so I'm confident that even though there's a lot of hostility between America and China at the moment, and the rest of the world in many ways, it's not going to last. It's not going to last because we can't let it last. This is going to lead to collisions and wars and poverty for a lot of people. If all of a sudden this whole system is thrown to the ground, we are going to regret the day that happened. So no, I can remember meeting with Deng Xiaoping in 1986 in China. He was the reformer, the great reformer. I had a lot of time with him. We had some great meetings. And he was forecasting a China that you see today without the malevolence, without the instinct for hegemony. He was talking about a much more cooperative China that he wanted to build, which indeed he did. And then we got off the rails the last number of years. And that has to be corrected and will be corrected because it must be corrected. It can't persist like this. We're just going this way towards a collision. And I think that informed, able leadership of the industrialized nations led by the United States of America, by inspired leadership from the United States, will put us back on the course. Look, when I was there, the challenge was not China, it was the Soviet Union. And the industrialized nations really, what happened, we got together, the G7, and the European Union and the others, we gave Ronald Reagan a blank check in terms of leadership. We supported the United States as he articulated a vision of freedom and growth with the Soviet Union, but through strength. And that's what's got us through the Cold War. The solidarity of the West in supporting the United States leadership in dealing with this extraordinary challenge.
You've had an amazing life, and you've got many more years left. I don't want to sound
certainly-
as if it's
I certainly
over.
hope.
Well, it's been a charmed life, you know, for a kid who grew up in northeastern Quebec. But I know that you wouldn't agree to that statement without acknowledging the person who has been at your side constantly for 49 years, the mother of your children. Tell me a little bit about your feelings about Mila Mulroney.
Well, it's right there in that book that you have, the memoirs. The dedication is simply to Mila. And the reason it's to Mila is because without Mila, I'm not sitting here. You're not interviewing me, because I wouldn't have, you know, as I often said, I could be back driving a truck in Baie-Comeau. Oh, she's been a marvelous person. She is a marvelous person, a fantastic influence on my life and our family. She's the leader. And she's sharp, well-intentioned for us all, but very, very, in many ways like Nancy Reagan, in the sense that she was very protective of me, very protective. And the only time I got into trouble was when I didn't listen to her advice about people and sometimes policy. No, she's been the heart and soul of the family.
Last question, one I ask all my guests on Canada Files, but I ask it of someone who has worn his national pride on his sleeve and in his heart for a few decades. What does being Canadian mean to you?
Well, it means, for some Canadians, as you know, it means not being an American. A lot of anti-Americanism around. I dispute that completely. For me, being a Canadian means taking pride in the citizenship we have in surely one of the greatest nations in the world. Our history tells us that. Our achievements, our bravery in World War I, World War II, Korea, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, the bravery of Canadians tells me that. The honor of our citizens, the greatness of our immigrant communities. There's never been a wave of immigration to Canada from anywhere that didn't enhance the dignity of our citizenship and the wealth of our nation. So we've been a welcoming nation, we've been a great nation, and we've done our share, more than our share, internationally. And that too is a matter of pride to me. And you know, when, for example, we talked earlier about Mandela, Canada took the lead in that, and Mandela never forgot it. But that's the Ethiopian famine, where we took the lead and, according to the experts, saved 7 million lives. Now, because we live next to the United States, the greatest country, the most powerful nation in the world, then oftentimes our achievements are lost in the mix because of the strength of America. If Canada, geographically, were placed in the middle of Europe, we'd be a superpower, even with our own 38 million people. But you know, you have to realize that that's the way it is. America, as I once said to the Americans, you know, if you don't like Canada, maybe you could have Russia as a neighbor up there, or China. How would you like that? In fact, this combination of Canada and the United States has been, as Winston Churchill said, like over 80 years ago, Churchill said, this is a model for the entire world. The cooperation and the achievements of Canada and the United States are an example for mankind. So I think that Canada, I take great pride in our country. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was privileged to be invited by the Canadian people to serve 2 terms as Prime Minister of Canada, which is a marvelous country. And even though the population didn't always appreciate what I was trying to do, that's the price you pay for living in a great democracy. And so I look back on it now, Jim, and I'm very, very happy, very satisfied. But I know that new young leaders will take us to greater heights. And if you look back at Canada 155 years from now, people will say, there is a country.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for your comments and your insight and your charm.
Thank you very much. Happy to be with you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. This is the final episode in Season 3 of Canada Files. And on behalf of all of us on the Canada Files crew, thank you, be safe, and be well.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the 63 Foundation, as well as the following donors: Ikito Investments Inc., the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Ted and Alice Kernahan, David and Cheryl Carr, Philip B. Lind, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, the North Pine Foundation, Francis and Eleanor Shen, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.